Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I think we're going to get started. So my name is Rebecca Heilweil. I'm an emerging technology reporter. So this panel is titled Internet from Space, Where LEO Services Fit into the Mix. So the reason why we're doing this panel is because we're basically entering a new era of space internet right now. We're increasingly hearing about accessing internet connection from space, and particularly from satellites and satellite constellations in low Earth orbit. So, satellite internet itself isn't particularly new. We've been accessing internet via satellite on planes for a really long time, but now we're hearing about it a lot more, particularly because of companies like SpaceX, OneWeb, Amazon getting really, really into this, as well as companies like T-Mobile and Apple also getting involved in satellite connection. At the same time, we're also hearing about governments also getting involved in this too, including Taiwan, the European Union, and China. So we're here to talk about what the case for this technology is, where it stands now, and also just how it works. So maybe before we start, I'd like our panelists to introduce themselves, if that sounds all right.
So hey everyone, my name's Jonathan Cannon. I'm with the R Street Institute. So I was asked today to join the panel to discuss something that I think is one of the most promising and exciting new technological innovations in the broadband industry. I mean, when we think of broadband, we think of traditional fiber optic network and literally having lines of fiber from home to home to connect people to the rest of the world. And this is something that completely changes that paradigm in a really novel and exciting way. And it may not necessarily be the most new, but I think we're finally beyond the proof of concept phase to this really being a meaningful technology that really can transform how we connect and interact with each other. So I'm really excited to have the discussion today.
Plus one to those comments. I'm Darren Acord with Amazon, Director of Connectivity Public Policy. My team and I support all connectivity policy related to Amazon, how our businesses connect, how our customers connect, and that also includes supporting Project Kuiper, our low Earth orbit, I should say LEO from now on, our low Earth orbit satellite constellation.
Great. So maybe we can just start with the basics for people who sort of know how satellite internet works. Can you explain how sort of these LEO constellations are different from what we've had in the past? What is so exciting or promising about this technology now, and sort of start from there?
Okay, I'll start us off. I think the big difference, first of all, is in the name, low Earth orbit. The low altitudes that these systems operate at, so for example, Project Kuiper's altitudes are approximately at 600 kilometers, which is much lower to the Earth compared to your traditional geostationary satellite systems by thousands of kilometers. And so what that equates to is much higher speeds, much lower latency, and better reliability because of the lower altitudes, because of multiple satellites into view, not just one satellite or a few satellites operating at a much higher altitude. And so with those low altitudes, with the capabilities in LEO, that also leads to better reliability to provide a much better customer experience. When you think of satellite broadband, I think that's where you see the differences of a LEO system and the experience that the customers will have.
So we're talking about, like hundreds and thousands of satellites as opposed to a handful.
Right.
Yeah.
For us specifically, we'll have approximately 3,200 satellites, and that's a big difference where I think, as you've noted in your article explaining some of this, where a GSO system, you'll have one satellite or a small number staying in one place, whereas a LEO system has multiple satellites revolving around the Earth in different altitudes, different orbits, in order to ensure better coverage and better use of the spectrum resources.
Can you explain, maybe Jonathan, if you want to chime in here, like why this would be particularly helpful or why you think this is necessary?
Yeah, I mean, so the use case that I always love, and obviously it's a more extreme one, is you take somewhere like the North Slope in Alaska. I mean, this area is covered in permafrost, so it's just geographically impossible just due to the vast distances, but also just the geography and the topography of the area. You cannot lay fiber in these communities, so these communities are dependent on alternative means of, connectivity and communication. So LEO really changes the game here because they're offering competitive products at competitive broadband prices using this network of low latency, high speed internet without, any optic cable going to the home. Right now, a lot of these communities rely on these outdated, like geostationary satellites with these massive dishes in these towns to pay hundreds of dollars for sub-broadband speeds.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in on that. I think the remote location is a great use case with the number of satellites, the coverage area that you can reach on the globe, and combined with the low altitudes, equates to all the benefits I talked about earlier, but in these remote locations, which may not have that level of service now. And also because of the altitude, our satellites, compared to a traditional satellite, it's a smaller beam hitting the ground. And so that's a more efficient use of the spectrum, and can enable more capacity for a system, which is incredibly important in those remote locations that we can reach that are beyond the reach of your traditional wired and wireless networks.
So I'm curious if you guys could talk a little bit about the transportation applications, because it seems like a lot of what we're hearing about right now with satellite internet is not, just people in their houses, but people traveling in RVs, on cruises, planes, and things like that. Is that something that you're looking at? Can you talk about that?
Yeah. The one thing that you hear a lot of is, I think it was Starlink that announced that they now have a terminal that you can put on a boat. So you can be out in the middle of the ocean on a large vessel with, hot, fast, high-speed broadband internet. But even on planes now, we're used to having to pay a crazy amount of money for really slow Wi-Fi that can barely load emails to having, regular broadband internet connection, where some countries have been going so far as to removing the restrictions on taking phone calls in planes. That's for another panel. But, just this rapid real-time communication anywhere on the globe in a way that we've just never seen before. It's really quite something.
Yeah, I agree. I think you can apply it to all use cases, whether it's commercial airlines, maritime customers operating over the ocean is a really good use case where, the satellites will be beaming up ocean, so to speak. And so that's plenty of capacity and capabilities over the oceans that airlines can use, that maritime customers can use, various use cases in those locations, as well as connecting, remote vehicles in rural areas.
So one of the things I've certainly been curious about, and I think some people are interested in as well, is, there was an effort in the 90s to create like LEO satellite internet constellations, and it sort of petered out and failed. I'm curious what changed. Why is this happening now? What has happened that sort of makes this possible?
First, I think the three of us maybe were elementary school or high school in the 90s, so we might not be the best people to provide the historical perspective. But as I understand it, I think we're kind of at an inflection point of technologies meeting up where the innovations and capabilities on the satellites, they're much better performing. It's also cheaper to produce them than in years past. The innovations that we're seeing, the customer terminal, the device that a consumer or a business will have at its location, we're seeing much better technology there. For example, we invented a new antenna for the type of spectrum that we use that reduces the size of the terminal so that it'll be cheaper to produce and easier to install. And so we're just continuing to see those innovations in the on-premise equipment. And then the cost of getting to space is much cheaper. We're seeing advancements in that industry. ULA, SpaceX, et cetera, Arianespace in Europe. All I think of those things are combining to where it's the technology meeting the capabilities in the sector at the right time.
Yeah, I think you touched on all the big pieces, but the fact that there is this amazing commercial space race happening. So not only do you have this massive innovation in terms of the technology of the satellites themselves, but rockets that can deploy 50 to 100 satellites at a time, and that capability and capacity is only increasing. So we're going to end up with more satellites than we're going to know what to do with.
Yeah, so I'm curious about how you would explain how satellite internet, we should be thinking about it compared to fiber, which is what a lot of people looking at this automatically think of. How does this sort of compare to that in terms of benefits and drawbacks, in terms of speed and latency and things like that?
So, my thing at least how I perceive things, is as technology evolves and this distinction between, fixed fiber and wireless is becoming so blurred now. In a lot of use cases, fiber still is the best and most efficient way of connecting, in like cities and suburban areas. But again, in these areas where that's not necessarily a practical thing, I don't think one technology should be favored over another. We had panels today and we've heard from the NTIA secretary about the innovation and, the massive investment in broadband. But that they're not sharing that vision of neutrality. They're not sharing that vision of applications like LEO that really can transform and have a profound impact on how, we get connected.
We see it as a complement. I think, as Jonathan said, there is a place for fiber. There is a place for wireless satellite. If you take a step back, everything Amazon does relies on connectivity. Everything our customers do rely on connectivity. So whatever way providers can reach the customers, we're behind, and so that is why we favor tech neutrality. We want as much being provided to consumers as possible, and we think satellite systems, particularly LEO systems, can complement those wired and wireless networks, especially where customers are beyond the reach of those traditional networks.
Are there any applications that you think this is really not right for, that maybe satellite internet, isn't the best option?
I don't want to speculate, but I think the urban use cases, I think, where cities are wired, where cities have fiber already, I think at the end of the day, the capabilities are there to where I think satellite can be a better complement in rural and remote locations.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm curious if you can talk about how many people you anticipate, if this really does take off, and we're still kind of in very early days of this technology. I'm curious how many people you anticipate using this in the long term. I know Starlink is at about 1 million customers signed up for its service. How many people could use satellite internet if everything's successful?
Short answer is I don't know. I think we envision serving millions of customers around the globe. I think same for Starlink. If you take a step back, I think solving the customers that need connectivity will require more providers, will require more than Starlink, more than Kuiper. So it's important that we continue implementing policies and FCC rules that support that and enable more providers to come online so we can reach all of the millions that need connectivity.
And I think, the only thing to add is just as the technology improves, the way that we can interface with the technology, if we have mobile devices that are able to connect to the satellites directly, that's going to be transformative to the number of users that you can have and how, far-reaching that connectivity can be.
Yeah, I think another sort of, the case that a lot of people make for this technology is that it's going to serve rural areas, underserved areas. What is the plan to make sure it's affordable to people who live there in these regions that aren't being served right now or aren't getting, internet speeds that are usable for today's, the way we use internet today?
For us specifically, I think as a starting point, low prices is in our DNA and a priority for Kuiper, just as part of Amazon. Our goal from day one has always been to launch an affordable service. We haven't announced price specifics yet. We're not operating, but where we have focused on innovating and bringing the cost down is with the customer terminal, the device that a customer, whether it's me in my house, a business, or whoever the customer might be, will have on premises. One of the challenges with these systems in the past has been the upfront cost of that device, because it's so high tech, and we have focused on bringing that down. So as I mentioned, we invented a new antenna for this type of terminal. It's a third the size of existing antennas that are out there, and that will equate to smaller size, easier installation. The size equals cheaper to produce at scale. We think those cost savings can be passed on to the customer. So for us, that's really where we've been focused on. We know the need is there, but how do we make it to where consumers can adopt it, not just have access?
And the only thing I'd add is just I think competition is going to be a huge driver for that as well. There's so many now entrants breaking into the space. that that's going to have an impact on costs. I mean, everyone's going to want to be competitive and offer the best product for the best price.
Yeah, I'm curious how many providers you think there's sort of enough room for in this market. Obviously, SpaceX, OneWeb, Amazon are getting into this. Do you see an upper limit on how many companies could really be offering this?
There's room for multiple providers, is our view.
I mean, the only thing I'll say is there's only so much room in space. There's got to be room for the satellites. But again, as the technology improves, I think that will remedy a lot of that concern.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people here are probably interested in some of the regulatory challenges that are raised by this technology. Maybe to start, I'm curious sort of on your view of how we should go about regulating this kind of technology where, we have different countries have their own regimes for regulating communications technologies, but, space is sort of every country sort of has a claim to space, if it were. And I'm curious how we should be thinking about that. Who should be in charge of regulating these technologies when you have, the FCC here, but certainly other agencies elsewhere that might have their own sort of inclinations on what the policy here should be?
Yeah, I think the challenge is just, again, this being so new, there really isn't like a clear regulatory paradigm. I mean, the FCC obviously has done a lot with communications technology, and, they've kind of positioned themselves to be the person to regulate this new technology. They're standing up a new space bureau, and it'll be interesting to see kind of how that evolves and develops. But I think they're still trying to figure out what they can do within their existing statutory authority. And obviously Congress is looking at this heavily. They've already had 2 hearings, and they're now pursuing different pieces of legislation to really see what they can do to allow this technology to flourish with hopefully a light touch approach.
Yeah, I think it's a big question, both in the U.S. and abroad. We feel like that inherently satellites operate with shared spectrum and in space and shared resources, and so that has to be taken into account in terms of how we're approaching regulations, what rules we're setting in place. We are hopeful that regulators can play a role in terms of convening stakeholders and working collaboratively to set norms, set standards that the industry can operate under. So, we think the FCC has taken great steps on rules in the area of spectrum coordination, critically important for these systems, and an area where clarity is needed. And as well with the Space Bureau, the Office of International Affairs that Chairwoman Rosenworcel has set up, bringing attention to these issues internationally, where the U.S. needs to play a leading role at the ITU, and we are hopeful that the U.S. government will continue to prioritize the satellite sector at the ITU and other international forums. We've seen it on Capitol Hill. We see that the FCC, there's bipartisan interest in the satellite industry. We want to make sure the U.S. government is supporting the sector internationally. Because to your point, with both spectrum and space, it's shared resources. And so we need to make sure that, one, the FCC continues to play a leading role, and then 2, globally, I think if we can have norms, rules that are scalable and the same as much as possible, I think that will benefit systems that have to operate globally and use shared resources.
I just want to highlight we will be taking some audience questions in a moment. If you're thinking of anything you want to ask the panelists. I'm curious, about your views on the FCC's new Space Bureau, which is sort of still being set up. But what do you see as the unanswered questions that need to be addressed by the FCC in terms of satellite internet? What are the things that do need more clarity, both sort of gestured to that, since this is such a kind of new service for a lot of people?
Sure. We really appreciate the steps that Chairwoman Rosenworcel has taken with the Space Bureau and the Office of International Affairs. Again, to repeat myself, I think calling attention to the issues at the ITU in the U.S. And prioritizing the sector, we think is very valuable and will be helpful for U.S. leadership in this area. One key area for us where we would like more clarity in the rules, to Jonathan's point, the sector has innovated very quickly. There are no rules currently for sharing spectrum between newer licensed systems like Kuiper and previously licensed systems, Starlink, OneWeb, and others. There are rules for sharing spectrum when you're licensed together and have the same rights. I don't want to get into the weeds of the FCC licensing system, But when you have new systems coming online, newer systems like us, or systems coming after us, there's not clear rules for how you're supposed to coordinate spectrum, other than previously licensed systems have priority, which is understandable. They've made investment-backed decisions, investment-backed designs. They need their operations protected, absolutely. But for systems like Kuiper and others that come behind us, we have to protect them. And that doesn't necessarily lead to incentives and coordination, or doesn't necessarily lead to good technical standards in how you share the spectrum. So we would just like to see more clarity there. The FCC has started a rulemaking. Comprehensive rulemaking is underway on spectrum sharing rules for LEO and GSO systems. We think it's a great step in the right direction and want to see that continue moving forward, because I think there's a number of issues in there, whether it's sharing spectrum, information sharing that you provide to others, what type of information that is, all of those things will be valuable to sharing this resource.
And, from the other side, more of the space sustainability and the space debris issue is, as Amazon noted, they're planning a constellation of about 3,000 satellites. Their competitors are planning much larger constellations. And, when we're putting, double, triple, even tenfold the number of bodies in space than we currently have, and that's just within the US. That's not even talking about what, China or other countries could do. And there's no kind of international policing. There's no one can say, no, China, you can't launch because America already has satellites there. So these are kind of very real issues that, a global stage will need to address and identify. And this is not something, the US can handle alone. Like, we can have a great sustainable way of deploying, competitive constellations in space. But that doesn't mean China's not going to put things up there to try and crash into ours. So, it's something that we're really going to have to deal with head on. And I think that's going to be something that we're going to really have challenges with, but I think we can do it.
Yeah, I'm curious about both of your views on the prospects of effectively regulating the challenge of space debris, which, just to fill anyone who's not familiar in, is, you put more and more satellites into orbit. There's also rocket parts flying around up there, really high speeds, incredibly dangerous, not just to other infrastructure in low Earth orbit, but also potentially to astronauts, people living aboard the International Space Station, other space stations. And what is the prospect for solving that problem, especially as the industry continues to put more stuff up there? Is it responsible to do that, given that it seems like we're still figuring out a sort of international solution to, basically this environmental challenge in low Earth orbit?
I think systems can deploy responsibly. You're absolutely right. The two key issues here for operating: access to spectrum, access to a safe operating environment in space. It's in everyone's best interest to deploy and operate safely in order to decrease risk of any incident or debris. And that has been a priority for us since day one, just as we designed our system, how we selected our altitudes, at heights that would ensure we could actively and rapidly deorbit if needed, the design of our satellites, having active propulsion on board so we can deorbit them, protection of systems such as coverings on fuel sources or other vital systems to the satellite, where if there was an object, you can handle the collision, mitigate any debris. And including just how we operate. I think we will conduct extensive testing on the ground. As I've heard the head of our business say, there is no repairman in space. So you better make sure that what you're launching works and is fully functioning. And so we are conducting extensive testing on the ground. Once they're launched, we'll test them extensively before we raise them into their orbits, and then make sure they're working there as well. And as a part of that, we need to share the data and how we do it. We need to know what we're learning from our system. We need to provide that with other operators. Hopefully they provide that as well. We need to be sharing information on how is our system operating, how is their system operating, to ensure that we're making best use of the resource. The more information sharing we can have, I think, the better to ensure that we're all operating in a responsible manner.
No, I mean, the only thing I would add is just, it's kind of proof of, everything that's been said. This isn't theoretical anymore. This is a real technology that is, going up in space. And, these companies, ultimately want to have customers, they want to have a successful product. So it's in everyone's best interest to make sure that, it's working efficiently and working well. And from a global perspective, is really it's ensuring that that framework is reflected, and these systems complement each other rather than, kind of working antagonistically towards one another.
Yeah, so one of the last sort of regulatory questions I want to ask you, or at least a government question, is I'm curious what you would say to people who are not necessarily critics of this industry, but say it's still very early. Should the government be subsidizing this industry to provide, internet access to communities that are underserved? Is there enough proof that this works so that the government should actively be providing funding to it? Like I said, Starlink has about 1 million customers right now. We're still waiting on Amazon to launch its first satellites. Is this ready for the government to step in and actually provide support for it? Given that that's a big part of how we address the digital divide in the United States, is just government grants.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what both Darren and I echoed. Is tech neutrality is critical. If we're making the biggest single time investment in broadband, we shouldn't be focusing on any one particular technology. And I think, the use case for this has been proven time and time again. But, I think there's other use cases as well that maybe aren't necessarily as discussed as often. In disaster situations, that you can rapidly deploy these networks. People lose connection after like a hurricane or something. You can have terminals set up on the ground and almost in real time, people are reconnected back to the internet. But we've never been able to do anything like that before. And I think that kind of application is really going to be transformative.
Yeah, I agree on we're supportive of a technology neutral approach. What makes the most sense for the consumer and getting that technology out in the most efficient manner possible. We haven't participated in funding, but it is a fair question. Public resources are being committed toward helping these systems and whatever that technology solution it is. And so, the ability to meet the standards and the ability to provide service that are expected under those programs is, it's a good question, and I think a fair priority for the government to have.
So I'm about to take a call for questions, but I'll ask you one closing question I have is just, what is, the biggest hurdle that you see to this right now that you're sort of hoping to solve in the next few years? And also, what is the milestone that, again, on a similar time frame, you're most looking forward to as sort of the next step for satellite internet and low Earth orbit constellations?
I will speak for Kuiper. The critically important thing for us right now, we would like to see the FCC move forward with its spectrum sharing proceeding. The FCC has taken a number of steps, and I compliment Chairwoman Rosenworcel, all three commissioners. It's been on a bipartisan basis, both to provide access to more spectrum for LEO systems, but also to move this rulemaking forward on sharing. We would like to see that continue. More broadly, we would like to see the U.S. government support the satellite sector at the ITU, at international forums, and support it along with the other technologies, not favor other technologies over satellite. We think U.S. leadership in this sector is critical. Milestone for Kuiper, it's an exciting time here. In the coming months, we will launch our first 2 satellites. We've announced our proto-flight missions will be launched from Florida on United Launch Alliance rockets. We will send up 2 satellites. We will test our capabilities both on the satellite and in our ground systems. And so that's exciting for us. I mean, we started this in 2019, got our FCC license in 2020, and here we are sending 2 satellites up into space. A big milestone as we get closer to full-scale deployment and connecting customers.
Yeah, and I mean, just, this is a real thing. This is happening. So, I mean, I see all the things that Darren reflected. But, U.S. leadership, I think, really is paramount importance here. China doesn't necessarily share the same regard for some of the space sustainability and other issues. And if their satellites crash into American satellites, like, too bad, so sad. So, we really want to push forward and advocate for strong international leadership, but also recognizing that this is a realistic option. It's a viable option. It's a strong alternative. And, we shouldn't shy away from using it and reflecting it as part of our, with our funding mechanisms with, in the most remote areas where we know we're never going to be able to reach them with fiber. I mean, this is a solid way to get people connected. This isn't just this miracle small use case system. I mean, this is transformative technology that I think has the potential to really change how we interact with one another. So I'm excited to see where it goes.
Okay, maybe people want to raise their hands with a question. Okay, maybe I'll start with the gentleman in the red shirt and we'll go this way.
The Starlink has seen the download speeds of the U.S. drop by a lot, about 10% of this, as this was city, means to see capacity. What steps are you taking to ensure that the hybrid is not all as it happened?
Yep, sorry. Not aware of Starlink's issues, but I think for us, just making sure that we're planning our deployment right and accounting for customer use cases as we scale and making sure that things are satellites, customer terminals, ground infrastructure are all fully operational to make sure that as we add satellites and add capacity, that we're meeting that customer demand.
Alex Howard, I'm curious about a bigger issue here. So the U.S. actually signed the Declaration of Human Rights, and as part of that, it says access to information is human right. Now that the U.S. government is back in the business of backing human rights again online, should we be subsidizing internet access in places where it's shut down? Whether it's the world's top shut down or internet, India taps to be an ally to or those that are not, whether it's Russia, Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and where else, which you all, Russian provider, used to shut that down. Which you think they would make sense for us as a country to be subsidized the services which would not limit access to our allies, for instance, as Starlink appears to be in Ukraine.
Do you want to start, Darren? It's a big question, but it's certainly a really important question.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think an inherently global system, we have to get licenses to operate in countries around the world. You raise a very good question on restricting access to information. I think we are taking that into account as we look at what countries we will operate in and making decisions that ensure we offer the best service for our customers while complying with the necessary laws and regulations and not operating in areas that may restrict that.
How would they stop? Which say, if you said we're going to get full access to open FDR systems as a expression of our values, Jeff Bezos thinks that's a good idea. So at some, would you say refuse to filter out information after a press of the Modi up?
It's a good question. I don't know. We're not operating yet. We don't have a license in India. We're not being asked that. And so I think it's a hypothetical factors that we may face.
Okay.
Jonathan, do you have a sort of position on whether the U.S. government should be funding these kind of networks to operate in the more authoritarian regimes that do censor internet access? Should this be a tool?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to any one technology or what the U.S. policy is as far as building out networks in other countries or, pushing and promoting the right to access to information. I think, we do value that information sharing, and I think it is important that everyone on the planet have access to internet service. But obviously there's geopolitics at play that can sometimes make that difficult or prohibitive. But, I think importantly, the value of this technology short term is helping, Americans that, don't have this necessarily restriction and, lack of access will feel like they're getting internet shut down. They just don't even have the ability to connect. And I think that's something, the U.S. government can more readily address on a short time frame.
Are there any other questions?
Great. Well, the second, sure.
You guys both talks a lot about the law and the building for what pre-shape the state the DD. We got a way to make one, which then did you prefer to add a regular speaking behaves? Added seats, doing that very fodder. Face training, look, got to see you, the tech rules. What it was like WEFs, ability rating, what's something that see here's the most helpful, or we're being needed to those guys?
I mean, I don't think we should necessarily preclude any one option. I mean, this all relies on comity between different nations. But I think, one country having leadership and pitching something that other countries will abide by, I think is, a critical piece. And I don't think there should be one, limited to one vehicle, but at the same time, you don't want to have overly prescribed regulation that could stifle, innovation and rollout of the industry either.
I would just add, we want the U.S. to play a leading role. I think the innovation and the leadership you're seeing in this sector is largely by 2 U.S. companies. And we want collaboration to continue. We've had active conversations. We're part of the dialogue with all the forums you reference, the Paris Peace Forum as well. Space sustainability is a big priority there. So we just want to see that collaboration continue, so norms can be developed amongst all forums that are involved in the process, and make sure that the regulatory bodies continue to play that convening role for industry.
Okay, I think we'll maybe take 2 more questions. I know you had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, staying on the international aid for a moment. You've got a country, say a small island developing country that's not being certified fiber optic and even with lead. What ingredients need to be there for them to issue a license and then provide this? Is it more about spectrum regulation, just a better orbit path covering some parts of the globe and other? What are the particular?
I think you touched on a couple of them there. I think a remote island country or state is a great use case for satellite systems, for LEO systems in particular. Depending on where it is geographically located, yes, the orbits could play a role, but you should be able. Most systems, or at least for Kuiper, we can cover 95% of the Earth's population, and so another piece would be is the infrastructure there on the ground, such as a satellite gateway station, in order to receive, in order to connect to the internet, or is there somewhere nearby that you can connect back to the internet? So I think in terms of, yes, we would need a license, but also need to look at the infrastructure capabilities. But the use case you bring up is a really good one, and really ideal for a system like Starlink or Kuiper.
Great. So I just want to follow up on that in terms of tying even the existing infrastructure. You all have sophisticated receivers in a pocket. So to what extent do you envision this actually as being direct to the user, or a bit of client and the require the vehicle view wireless as well?
Our system will be direct to user in terms of the customer terminal at the home, at the business, wherever you're on premises. We're seeing, obviously, we have, we're hearing and seeing agreements about direct to sell. The FCC is starting a rulemaking on that. And so I think it's another example of the continued innovation in the sector. And we're, looking forward to the rulemaking and seeing how it plays out. But I think it's, again, just another positive use case example that's becoming possible now.
Great. Well, I think that was the last question, but thank you all for coming. This was so interesting, and thank you so much to our panelists. It's great to check in on this technology.